Clara had imagined her wedding day 1,000 different ways, but never like this, never stepping off a wagon into a cold, wind-whipped evening, with her heart pounding in hope, only to have that hope crushed within seconds. She clutched her small trunk with both hands, dressed hem-soaked from the rain, cheeks flushed with nerves and exhaustion. As she approached the door of the man she'd been promised to, the man who written her letters filled with gentle words and promises of a home. She knocked softly at first, then harder, when no answer came. Finally, the door creaked open, and there he stood, unshaven, irritated, and looking nothing like the polite gentleman who had signed each letter yours, always. His eyes flicked over her once, cold and dismissive, and Clara felt her stomach drop. Without a greeting, without a single word, he muttered, "Change of plans," and shut the door in her face, leaving her alone on the porch with the storm rolling in. Rain began to fall harder, stinging her skin, soaking her braided hair until it clung to her neck. She looked around helplessly at the endless prairie, where each gust of wind carried the echo of her humiliation. Her chest tightened as the last fragile piece of her dignity tried to hold itself together. She had no family waiting, no money to return home, no neighbor to call a friend. She was a mail-order bride, cast off like an unwanted package. As she stood there shivering, rejected, and trying not to cry, a lantern flickered from the ranch across the field. Eli Turner, the solitary cowboy known for keeping to himself, paused mid-step as he witnessed the silent heartbreak unfolding from a distance. He saw her trembling form, the closed door, the discarded trunk. Something in his chest tugged a warning or a calling. He wasn't sure. Clara hugged her arms around herself, whispering, "What do I do now?" to no one but the wind. The sky darkened, her hope dimming with it, as she considered curling up on the porch just to make it through the night. But fate, quiet and watchful, had already begun shifting. The cowboy next door had seen everything, and a woman left out in the storm was something no decent man could ignore. Eli Turner had never been a man who invited trouble. He fed his cattle, fixed what needed fixing, and kept his heart locked away where no one could disturb it. But, as he stood on his porch, rain dripping off the brim of his hat, he couldn't look away from the abandoned woman across the field. Clara stood motionless, hugging herself against the storm, her trunk beside her like a final reminder of how little the world had given her. Eli exhaled deeply, muttering under his breath about fool neighbors and damned cowards, yet his boots were already carrying him toward her, splashing through mud that clung to his steps like fate, urging him forward. He didn't know her name, didn't know her story, didn't need to. All he saw was a woman discarded like she had no worth, left to weather the cold without a shred of decency from the man who'd promised to take her in. When he reached the porch, Clara looked up with wide, frightened eyes, as if unsure whether he meant to help her or join the long list of disappointments life had thrown her way. Eli tipped his hat, not quite comfortable meeting her gaze, and said in his low, steady voice, "You can't stay out here. Storm'll only get worse." She hesitated, gripping her trunk as though it was the only anchor she had left. Eli didn't touch her, didn't push. He simply waited, patient as the land he worked, giving her the dignity to choose. Finally, with a trembling nod, Clara allowed him to take the handle of her trunk. I don't want trouble," she whispered. Eli looked at the closed door behind her and felt a protective anger rise in his chest. "Trouble ain't you," he said firmly. "Trouble's the man who did this." He guided her through the downpour toward his ranch, keeping a respectful distance, but shielding her as much as he could from the raging wind. Each step he took felt heavier, as if his quiet, orderly life was shifting in ways he couldn't yet understand. He hadn't meant to involve himself, yet leaving her behind had never really been an option. And Clara, though still trembling, felt something unexpected in the cowboy's presence, the smallest flicker of safety in a world that had offered her none. Inside Eli Turner's ranch house, Clara felt the warmth wrap around her like a blanket she didn't realize she'd been aching for, though she stayed standing near the door, as if she feared she might be asked to leave again. Eli set her trunk down gently, wiped the rain from his brow, and spoke in that calm, even tone of his that seemed to steady the air itself. "There is a room down the hall. You can use it for as long as you need. No questions, no judgment, no prying curiosity. Just a simple offer, given without condition." Clara's fingers tightened around the wet fabric of her skirt as she watched him move about the kitchen, lighting the lamp setting. A pot of water too warm, doing everything with the quiet efficiency of a man used to solitude. She expected interrogation, expected suspicion, expected the kind of cold regard she'd received her entire life. But Eli only glanced at her long enough to make sure she wasn't about to collapse. When he handed her a towel and dry clothes that clearly belonged to someone bigger, someone stronger, she whispered a shaky thank you, her voice catching on the weight of her exhaustion. She retreated to the spare room, expecting little more than a cot, but found a neatly made bed, a quilt patched with care, and a small window overlooking the pasture place that felt lived in, safe, almost welcoming. After changing, she returned to the kitchen, drawn by the smell of soup simmering on the stove. Eli didn't comment on how the sleeves hung past her hands or how her damp braid clung to her cheek. He simply slid a bowl toward her and said, "Eat." Clara sat carefully, unsure if she was intruding, but the first spoonful brought tears she didn't mean to shed. Eli pretended not to notice, staring into his own bowl as though the nuts in the wood grain suddenly required deep study. She had been bought, traded, abandoned, but not here. Here, she wasn't a burden or a bargain. She was simply a person in need of shelter, and Eli gave it without expecting anything in return. In that quiet kitchen, with rain tapping softly against the window, Clara felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. The faint, fragile beginning of belonging. Clara had just begun to settle into the rhythm of Eli's quiet ranch life, mornings filled with soft light through the kitchen window, evenings spent stitching by the fire, while Eli read the same newspaper 3 times, as if afraid of disturbing the room. When the peace shuddered with a furious pounding on the door, the moment she heard that voice, slurred and sharp, her breath caught in her throat. Her would-be fiancé had returned. Fear shot through her like lightning, rooting her in place as Eli stepped forward, jaw tightening with a protectiveness he didn't fully understand yet. When he opened the door, the man staggered inside the threshold, rain dripping off his hat, eyes bloodshot with rage and self-pity. "She's mine," he barked, pointing a shaking finger past Eli toward Clara, who stood trembling behind the table. "She came here for me." Eli didn't raise his voice, didn't step aside. He simply squared his shoulders, blocking the man's path, with the calm, immovable strength of someone who'd spent his whole life standing against storms, both natural and man-made. "You threw her away," he sighed evenly. "You don't get to come claim her now." The man cursed, lunging forward, but Eli caught him by the collar and shoved him back onto the porch, the action so swift and controlled it stunned Clara into silence. "You come near her again," Eli warned, "and it won't be words you'll be dealing with." The door slammed shut, rattling in its frame, leaving only the sound of Clara's ragged breaths filling the kitchen. She sank to a chair, hands trembling uncontrollably, while Eli stood with his back to her, fists still clenched, chest rising and falling with leftover adrenaline. After a moment, he turned, his voice softer but steady. "He won't touch you," he said, as if it were a fact carved into the earth itself. Clara looked up at him, tears welling not from fear this time, but from the dawning realization that someone this quiet, guarded cowboy had chosen to stand between her and the world's cruelty without expecting anything in return. Eli had given her shelter, but in that moment, he gave her something far more precious. The sense that her safety mattered to someone. Perhaps, for the first time in her life. In the days that followed the confrontation, something unspoken began weaving itself between Clara and Eli, something soft, fragile, and impossible to ignore. Clara moved through the ranch with a gentleness that seemed to settle into the walls themselves, humming softly as she swept the porch, mending Eli's torn shirts with careful stitches, and tending the small garden behind the house, as if nurturing life came naturally to her. Eli, who'd spent years in near total silence, found his world suddenly filled with small, comforting sounds. Her light footsteps in the hallway, the quiet clatter of dishes, the whisper of her voice as she read old letters by the fire. He didn't understand how she did it, but her presence eased a loneliness he'd worn like a second skin. Clara in turn noticed the way Eli lingered nearby, without quite meaning to, the way he'd paused while chopping wood if he heard her laugh, or how he'd sit at the table a few minutes longer just to listen to her talk about the book she'd found on his shelf. One evening she was hanging laundry behind the barn, when a memory swept over her of the life she'd almost had, the rejection she suffered, tanned the emotions she'd kept buried, broke loose in a sudden burst of tears. She tried to hide it, wiping her cheeks quickly, but Eli approached quietly, stopping a respectful distance away. "You all right?" he asked, his voice low, but laced with concern that touched her deeper than any grand gesture ever could. The question unraveled her, and before she could form a lie, her shoulders trembled again. Eli didn't touch her at first, didn't crowd or overwhelm. He simply slipped his coat around her, warm and heavy, like a shield against the world. When she leaned into him, seeking comfort she hadn't allowed herself in months, his arms came around her with a hesitant tenderness that melted every wall she'd built. No promises were spoken, no declarations made, but in that quiet embrace, beneath the setting sun, Clara felt the ache inside her ease for the first time in what felt like forever. And Eli, holding her close, realized with a breathless certainty that he had begun wanting something far more dangerous and beautiful than simple responsibility. He wanted a place in her heart. Winter crept slowly over the plains, softening the world with frost and long, hushed evenings that drew Clara and Eli closer than either intended, as though the cold pushed them toward the warmth only the other could give. Nights were spent by the fireplace, where Clara stitched small pieces of her past into a quilt, while Eli pretended to read, turning the same page over and over, far more attuned to the quiet rhythm of her presence than to any words on the paper. Their conversations deepened without either of them noticing, starting with simple talk about ranch, chores, and drifting into stories of childhood, fears they'd never voiced aloud, hopes too fragile to share with anyone else. Clara found herself laughing at Eli's dry humor, a sound that made his eyes warm in a way she could feel in her chest, and Eli found himself glancing at her more, often as if memorizing the way her face softened in the firelight, or the way her hands moved when she spoke. One snowy evening, she thanked him softly for saving her life, not just by giving her shelter, but by giving her back pieces of herself she thought she'd lost forever. Eli shifted in his chair, uncomfortable with praise, but unable to hide the way her words stirred something deep and tender within him. "You saved this place too," he said quietly, surprising even himself. "Been too still, too empty." Clara's breath caught, not from the cold, but from the raw honesty in his voice, a truth he never meant to reveal. Their eyes met, holding in a fragile, breathless moment where unspoken feelings brushed dangerously close to the surface. Eli's gaze dipped to her lips for a heartbeat before he looked away, clearing his throat and claiming the fire needed tending. Clara, cheeks warm, folded her hands in her lap, trying to steady the flutter rising inside her. Nothing more was said, but everything had changed, subtle, slow, like the first bloom beneath winter frost. Each shared glance became heavier, each brush of hands a spark neither dared address, and though neither spoke the feelings forming between them, both felt the truth settling deeply. Quietly, they were no longer just sharing a home, they were beginning to share a heart. "You said." The fragile piece of winter shattered the morning Clara's former fiancés rode back onto Eli's land, his anger more dangerous now that shame and liquor had hardened it into spite. Clara froze on the porch, the broom slipping from her fingers as the man swung down from his horse, shouting that she belonged to him, that he had a right to take back what he'd tossed aside. The fear she thought she'd left behind surged through her, tightening her throat, but before she could step back, Eli was already there, coming out of the barn with a fury Clara had never seen in him. He placed himself between her and the man, jaw clenched, shoulders squared, every line in his body radiating a protective strength that sent a shiver of relief through her. The sheriff soon arrived, summoned by a ranch hand who'd seen trouble brewing, and with a firm, quiet authority Eli stood by while the law made it clear. The man had forfeited every claim when he abandoned her, as he was dragged off, cursing and struggling. Clara's knees weakened, the world spinning, until Eli's steady presence anchored her again. She turned to him, trembling, her voice cracking as she whispered, "Why? Why do you keep fighting for me?" Her question hung in the cold air, and Eli's breath caught, his guard falling away like a door unlatched. He stepped closer, not touching her, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, because somewhere along the way, he began slowly, eyes searching hers with a vulnerability she'd never seen in him. "You became someone I couldn't imagine losing, someone I want to protect, someone I—" His voice faltered before he finally admitted, "Someone I love." Clara's heart stopped, then raced, a wild, overwhelming rush of emotion flooding through her. She reached up with a trembling hand, pressing her palm to his chest, where his heartbeat thundered beneath her touch. "Eli," she breathed, tears spilling freely now, "you became my home long before I realized it." The confession softened his expression into something almost fragile, almost reverent, as if her words were the answer to a prayer he never dared voice. And as the winter wind swept across the port, carrying away the last shadows of her past, Clara stepped into his arms, finding, at last, the safety, the warmth, the love she'd once believed she would never deserve. Spring arrived gently on Eli's ranch, softening the earth, coaxing wildflowers from the ground, and wrapping the world in the kind of warmth that mirrored the new life growing between Clara and Eli, steady, tender and rooted in everything they had survived together. The wedding they held was small, quiet and perfect in its simplicity. Just a handful of neighbors, the sheriff who had stood by Clara, and the wide endless prairie, as witness to a love neither of them had imagined when fate first pushed their lives together. Clara wore a simple cream dress she'd sewn herself, the hem brushing her boots, her smile brighter than any jewel she could have worn. And Eli, usually so stoic, couldn't take his eyes off her, his heart thundering with a mixture of awe and disbelief that she had chosen him as surely as he had chosen her. When he took her hands in his rough palms, cradling her delicate fingers, he didn't say the practiced vows the pastor offered. Instead, he murmured his own in a low, trembling voice that carried more truth than any scripture. "I'll give you a life with steady ground beneath your feet and warmth in every season," he promised. "You'll never stand alone again, not as long as I draw breath." Clara's tears shimmered as she whispered her vows, in return telling him he had given her what she never thought she'd find. Not just shelter, but belonging. Not just safety, but a place where her heart could grow without fear. They sealed their promises with a kiss soft as spring rain, one that held all the quiet devotion that had grown between them long before either dared put it into words. The wedding feast was modest: fresh bread, roasted chicken, sweet preserves, but Clara had never tasted a meal so rich, nor seen Eli smile so freely, his dimples deepening as neighbors teased him about finally allowing joy into his life. That evening, as the lanterns dimmed and the guests rode home, Clara stood with Eli on the same porch where her story of heartbreak had begun. The sunset painting the sky gold and rose, Eli wrapped his arms around her, resting his chin atop her head, and she leaned into him with a peace so complete it felt like destiny settling into place. The woman who had once been abandoned now stood cherished and chosen, and the man who had lived in quiet solitude had found a love strong enough to change the shape of his entire world. Together, hand in hand, they stepped into their future, no longer two wounded souls, but one heart, one home, one unwavering promise of forever. "You said